In 1884, they drew lines across Africa. In 2025, a 72-year-old woman began erasing them. Her name, President Netumbo Nandi-Ndaitwah. But her people now call her something else, the Lioness of Southern Africa. They called her old. She called herself ready. They said she would be ceremonial. She picked up the pen of history and rewrote the first paragraph. They warned she would face backlash. She said, "Let them come." And when she opened the borders, nationalized oil, and rejected Western trials on African women, they finally understood. She didn't come to lead. She came to liberate. The world held its breath, but Africa began to breathe again. Stay with us, because this isn't just another story. It's the roar of a lioness echoing across a continent once silenced. Subscribe now, because truth should never need permission to be told. The border that became a bridge. It began with a policy that sounded too simple to matter. On October 24th, 2023, during Zambia's Independence Day celebration in Windhoek, Namibia's Minister of Home Affairs stood behind a podium and made a quiet announcement. Zambians and Namibians would soon be allowed to cross each other's borders using only their national ID cards. No more passports, no more visa queues, just one card, one people, one step closer to something sacred, freedom of movement. To the casual observer, it was a bureaucratic update. To the children of Africa, it was a spark, because behind that small policy was a much bigger truth. Someone had finally started tearing down the Berlin walls of Africa, not with hammers, but with conviction. For over a century, African families have lived with borders they didn't draw. Invisible fences built by foreign hands in 1884, fences that cut through villages, families, riverbanks, fields, and futures. The farmer in Katima Mulilo who sells tomatoes across the Zambezi, the mother in Sesheke who visits her sister in Windhoek, and the trader from Mongu who carries maize to Gobabis. Every one of them has faced the weight of paperwork, fees, checkpoints, and suspicion just to visit the next town over. That's what colonialism left behind. Fear at the border, poverty in motion. But President Netumbo Nandi-Ndaitwah changed that. She didn't just inherit the Botswana Agreement, which already allowed free travel between Botswana and Namibians. She expanded it. She wove Zambia into the same thread. She dared to suggest that Africans do not need permission to walk across African soil. And this is where the West began to panic. Because in the minds of the old order, Africa's borders are not just lines, they are leashes. Leashes of division, of control, of quiet, endless extraction. The passport, in this context, isn't just a travel document, it's a denial slip. It tells a rural grandmother she is too poor to belong. It tells the border boy with calloused feet and dreams of trade, you need foreign approval to cross into your own continent. But with one policy, that denial collapsed, and the ripple was instant. In the markets of Katet, traders whispered of new possibilities. In Livingstone, families separated by a river smiled at the thought of reunion. In Windhoek, youth leaders called it paper revolution, and the numbers followed. Economic analysts in Lusaka projected up to 30% savings on informal trade costs. Namibia's Transport Authority reported a surge in border movement that same quarter, and small cooperatives on both sides selling tomatoes, fish, maize, clothes began forming cross-border unions. This wasn't just policy, it was prophecy fulfilled. Because for decades, African leaders have spoken of Pan-Africanism, of unity, of dignity without division. But too often, their speeches never crossed into action. Nandi-Ndaitwah crossed, quietly, boldly. Captain Ibrahim's latest news had already set the Sahel ablaze with anti-colonial fire. Now, down south, a grandmother with steel in her spine was turning border crossings into acts of resistance. And suddenly, a southern axis was forming Namibia, Zambia, Botswana. Could Zimbabwe follow? Angola? Even South Africa? If that alliance grows, it will not only be a political shift, it will be an economic earthquake. Namibia has uranium, Zambia has copper, Botswana has diamonds. Together, they form a corridor of minerals, mines, and markets. The West fears one thing, Africa negotiating as a bloc, because a divided Africa can be bought. but a united one must be respected. And that's the quiet genius of Nandinua's move. With one ID card, she didn't just free travelers, she freed the idea that Africans must forever ask to enter what was always theirs. The Berlin Conference drew lines. Netumbo Nandinua is redrawing destiny. The oil belongs to the people. On March 22, 2025, while the red carpets of her inauguration were still being rolled away, President Netumbo Nandinua dropped a political bombshell. Namibia's entire oil and gas sector would be placed under the direct authority of the presidential office. No debates, no delays, no apologies. Shell didn't see it coming. Neither did Total Energies. For decades, foreign giants drilled beneath Namibia's Atlantic waters, claiming, extracting, profiting. Offshore fields projected to produce 700,000 barrels per day by 2030 had long been earmarked for export, not empowerment. But now, the oil had a new address: State House, Windhoek. This was not privatization, it was decolonization, and it sent shivers from the banks of the Rhine to the corridors of Washington. To the west, it was theft. To Namibians, it was justice finally delivered. In Katutura's townships, the reaction was electric. Radio hosts cheered her name. Call-in shows erupted with praise. One retired dockworker said, "All my life, I've watched our riches sail away while we live on crumbs." Today, the ship turns around. This wasn't an economic stunt. It was the reclamation of stolen time. Because for over a century, Africa has bled wealth while receiving little more than aid and austerity. European companies took oil, diamonds, cobalt, then gave back debts, interest rates, and reports. And yet, when an African government reclaims control, the headlines shift. Authoritarian, dangerous, unstable. But there was nothing unstable about what Nandinua did. She stared down the most powerful corporations on earth and didn't blink. She declared, "Namibia will not be a petrol station for the West. It will be a power source for its own people." Western analysts panicked. News outlets speculated about sanctions. Investors threatened legal action. But none of it mattered inside Namibia. The people had already chosen. They chose sovereignty over silence. For too long, African leaders have been advised to go slow. But Nandinua understands something deeper. In a global system rigged against you, caution is complicity. And she was not about to be complicit. In her speech, she made it clear Namibia's resources would fuel Namibian development schools, hospitals, clean energy, industries, not Swiss bank accounts, not offshore havens, and the implications reached far beyond Windhoek. African think tanks began drawing maps. If Namibia could nationalize oil successfully, could Angola follow? Nigeria, Senegal. The West understood the danger. If more nations asserted resource sovereignty, the entire post-colonial extraction model would crumble. Contracts would be revisited, royalties demanded, and Africa, finally, would name its price. Burkina Faso latest news had already shown how swiftly control could shift when a people decide their wealth no longer belongs to outsiders. And make no mistake, this was about control. Total Energies had planned to dominate Namibia's deep water blocks for decades. Shell had quietly negotiated transit rights and futures contracts. Billions were at stake. But Netumbo Nandinua didn't flinch. She put her country before corporate diplomacy, and in doing so, she redefined what leadership in Africa could look like. She wasn't alone in history. From Nkrumah to Sankara, from Chavez to Evo Morales, the reclaiming of natural wealth has always been a revolutionary act. But in 2025, it came from a woman the West had dismissed as ceremonial. A 72-year-old liberation fighter, now leading the second liberation with oil instead of rifles. And that's why they fear her. Because if she succeeds, if Namibia turns oil into infrastructure, prosperity, and dignity, it will ignite a chain reaction. Other nations will follow, and the global game will shift. So the West whispers, unstable, authoritarian, dangerous. But inside Africa, another word is rising. Unbought. Netumbo Nandinua is not for sale, and neither is Namibia's oil. Blood debts never die. In April 2025, just weeks into her presidency, Netumbo Nandi-Ndaitwah did what generations of African leaders feared to do. She looked Germany in the eye and demanded justice, not condolences. She wasn't asking for statements. She was calling for reparations. Because between 1904 and 1908, German colonial troops in what is now Namibia unleashed one of the first genocides of the 20th century. Over 100,000 Herero and Nama people were hunted, slaughtered, driven into the desert, starved, raped, and imprisoned in death camps. And for more than a century, Berlin offered only gestures, regret without responsibility, memorials without money, apologies without accountability. President Nandi-Ndaitwah changed that. In a blistering interview with the BBC, she said what no president before her had dared. Our ancestors' blood cannot be appeased by half measures. It was not just a rebuke, it was a reckoning. Suddenly, Europe found itself cornered, not by threats, but by truth, because if Namibia's claim succeeded, it could open floodgates. From Belgian atrocities in the Congo to British massacres in Kenya, the archives of colonialism are soaked in blood, and every wound could come calling. Germany scrambled. Diplomats flew to Windhoek. Advisors issued press statements. But the line had already been drawn by a grandmother who knew history because her family lived through it. This was personal. Nandi-Ndaitwah's father had told her stories of the Herero skulls shipped to German museums. Her village had descendants of Nama elders who died in forced labor camps. For her, this wasn't a negotiation. It was a funeral interrupted, and the funeral needed closure. But the call for reparations wasn't just about the past. It was about the present that still bleeds. Namibia's land remains unequally owned, 70% of farmland still controlled by descendants of colonial settlers. Its economy, still shaped by extraction, mirrors systems designed to favor Europe. So when Nandi-Ndaitwah demanded reparations, she wasn't just asking for Germany to pay. She was asking for Namibia to breathe. And across Africa, the response was electric. Young people flooded social media with posts saying, "Tell them to pay up." Hashtags like reparations now and Herero justice trended across the continent. History teachers downloaded her speeches. Student unions in Kenya, Nigeria, Ghana hosted discussions on colonial crimes and how to make Europe answer. And beyond Africa, in Black communities across the diaspora from Atlanta to Brixton, her voice echoed. Because the story of stolen Black futures is not exclusive to Namibia. It belongs to enslaved Africans in Haiti, to displaced Jamaicans in Windrush, to redline families in Detroit. President Nandi-Ndaitwah's stand reminded us all, you cannot heal what you refuse to admit. Of course, the West recoiled. German media called her provocative. Think tanks warned of diplomatic instability, but none of it changed the truth. Europe built its wealth on African corpses, and someone had finally issued the invoice. She had resurrected what they buried. And in that resurrection, she did something rare. She gave African grief a voice louder than silence, because we must never forget, history does not die. It waits, in bones, in soil, in names. The Herero and Nama were not statistics. They were fathers, daughters, midwives, dreamers erased but not forgotten. And now they speak again, through her. In a world that tells Africa to move on, President Nandi-Ndaitwah is asking, move on to what? A future built on a past we never survived. She is not clinging to trauma. She is calling for repair, for honor, for peace with dignity, because blood debts do not expire. They are either paid or they are inherited. Our womb is not your lab. In August 2025, President Netumbo Nandi-Ndaitwah made a declaration that thundered through every corner of Africa. Namibia's women are not guinea pigs. Our future is not a laboratory. The target of her fury, a proposal from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to conduct trials of an 8-year hormonal intrauterine device, an IUD, on Namibian women, a device untested anywhere else, a device Western regulators hadn't approved for their own citizens. Yet somehow, they believed it was fit for Africa. Nandi-Ndaitwah said no, And in that moment, millions of African women finally heard a president speak for them, because for decades, Africa has been the silent petri dish of Western ambition, from vaccine tests in Kenya to HIV drug trials in Zimbabwe to Tuskegee in the United States. Black bodies have been treated as expendable, as data points, as test beds. But in 2025, Namibia drew a red line. The backlash was immediate. Gates Foundation representatives scrambled to justify the trial. Global media outlets called her anti-science, emotional, uninformed. But African women were not fooled. They remembered the Depo-Provera injections in Ethiopia that left countless women sterilized, the Trovan trials in Nigeria that led to child deaths, the silent pain passed from generation to generation, never compensated, never even acknowledged. So when Nandinua raised her voice, she wasn't being dramatic. She was doing what no president had done so publicly, calling out a quiet war on black women's bodies. The hashtags erupted. Not your lab. Africa can decide. Protect black wombs. In Windhoek, women's rights groups marched to parliament carrying banners that read, "We birthed this nation. You will not test us to death." In Accra, Nairobi, and Johannesburg, civil society groups issued statements of solidarity. Even black scholars in the US and UK rallied behind her stand, because this wasn't just about science. It was about sovereignty over biology. In her televised address, Nandinua asked a piercing question. If these devices are so safe, why are they not being trialed in Europe first? Why here? Why us? No one could answer, because everyone already knew. The West expects Africa to accept risk without rights, to absorb side effects without lawsuits, to serve as experimental terrain while others reap the safety. But Namibia's lioness refused, and her refusal is already reshaping the continent's medical conversations. Health ministers in Malawi, Senegal, and Uganda quietly began reviewing their clinical trial agreements. Legislators in Tanzania proposed a bill requiring foreign pharmaceutical companies to prove domestic testing before applying to Africa. Young activists launched the Informed Consent Africa campaign, demanding transparency, ethics, and accountability. President Nandinua didn't just block one trial, she sparked a continent-wide awakening. And that is why the backlash turned brutal. Western outlets painted her as a populist. Medical journals called her reckless. Diplomats whispered about aid cuts. But in Africa, her name was chanted. She was not anti-West. She was pro-dignity. She was not anti-science. She was anti-experimentation without consent. And at 72, she was defending the next generation of girls who would not have to wonder if their pain was part of the trial. Because she understood. Freedom is not just about land. It's about the body, the womb, the right to say no. In a world that still sees Africa as open ground for closed-door trials, her voice rose like a shield. Our womb is not your lab. If you believe this is what Africa needed all along, say amen in the comments below. The promise that delivered. On April 24th, 2025, President Netumbo Nandinua stepped up to the podium for her first State of the Nation address. What she delivered wasn't a speech. It was a blueprint. No empty slogans, no vague promises. She unveiled NDP6, Namibia's 6th National Development Plan, and unlike the dusty reports of the past, this one didn't gather silence. It sparked something raw, something rare in African politics. Belief that a government could serve its people, not itself. Because after decades of seeing their minerals exported raw, their youth unemployed, and their land hoarded, Namibians were ready for more than hope. They were ready for delivery, and Nandinua delivered. She pledged to restore Namibia's status as an upper-middle-income country by 2030, not through aid, but through self-sufficiency. Her plan: invest in agriculture to reduce food imports, expand value-added manufacturing so Namibia no longer just dug but also built, and for the first time, turn uranium not into exports, but energy. Nuclear power studies began within weeks. Local cooperatives received seed capital, and just 3 months in, small factories in Walvis Bay began producing components for solar and wind. But it didn't stop at industry. Nandinua turned inward to the soul of the country, education. In a historic move, she announced that from 2026, tertiary education would be free for Namibian citizens. The reaction? Explosive. In Windhoek suburbs, families cried on live TV. In the rural north, grandparents called radio stations in disbelief. For a generation told to dream, but never supported. This was more than a policy. It was a resurrection. But she knew that free education without jobs was just a delayed betrayal. So she went further. A $257 million youth business fund was launched designed to fight the 4% youth unemployment rate. And to match it, she unveiled a national internship program, placing thousands of graduates into government and private sector roles with real skills, real mentors, real chances. Then came the housing crisis. For years, Windhoek's working poor were priced out of their own city. Nandinua promised 10,000 units of low-cost housing every year. Her message: no Namibian should work all their life and still sleep on concrete. But perhaps her boldest domestic move came on April 27, 2025. In a televised address, she declared corruption to be a form of treason. Hours later, her Minister of Agriculture, Fisheries, Water, and Land Reform, arrested on graft charges, was dismissed without ceremony. The signal was unmistakable. The age of sacred cows was over. She didn't stop there. She cut the size of government from 21 ministries to 14. She kept only 3 ministers from the previous regime. The rest, a new guard, young, fierce, and ready. Among them, Lucia Witbui, Vice President, Elijah Enorari, Prime Minister, Esperan Luenda, just 31. As Minister of Health and Social Services, she wasn't recycling elites, she was rebuilding faith. And across the region, the impact rippled. Think tanks in Zambia and Botswana began citing Namibia's reforms as a regional model. SADC discussions shifted from integration theory to Nandinua-style delivery. Because when one country shows it can be done, others can no longer pretend it cannot. Of course, critics circled. The IMF warned of fiscal strain. Credit agencies threatened a downgrade. Some opposition voices accused her of centralizing power, especially after oil was placed under her direct control. But to the ordinary Namibian, the math was simple. For the first time, promises were meeting reality. She was not perfect, but she was present. Fierce, uncompromising, real, and in a continent often asked to choose between democracy and delivery, Nandinua was asking, why not both? Namibia had stopped whispering. It had begun to build. They called her ceremonial. They now call her unstoppable. From the borders of Zambia to the oil fields off the Atlantic, from the courtrooms of Berlin to the wombs of African women, President Netumbo Nandinua has done more than govern she has ignited. But with fire comes danger. History reminds us, when African leaders dare to rise, retaliation follows. Patrice Lumumba, Thomas Sankara, Muammar Gaddafi, each dared, each fell, because the West does not fear violence. It fears vision, and Nandinua carries a vision that terrifies them. An Africa unchained from colonial borders, an Africa that owns its oil, an Africa that educates its youth without foreign strings, an Africa where black women are not experimental subjects, an Africa that demands justice, not charity. Her courage is her power, and perhaps her vulnerability. Already, whispers of sanctions float from Brussels. IMF officials murmur about instability. Anonymous sources warn of isolation. But isolation from whom? The same voices who never came when Africa was bleeding. The tide is turning. Captain Ibrahim's latest news has already proven that the Sahel can stand tall. Now, with Nandinua's voice thundering from Windhoek, the South has risen. Imagine a future where Namibia's uranium fuels clean African energy.